In 1948, a man built the safest, most advanced car in American history. The government called it fraud. The media called it a pipe dream. Within 2 years, the company was gone. But here is what almost nobody tells you. Every safety feature the prosecutors mocked as impossible was made mandatory within 20 years of his acquittal. His name was Preston Tucker, and this is the story the industry did not want told. Preston Thomas Tucker was born in 1903 on a peppermint farm near Michigan and grew up in the Detroit suburbs at the exact moment the automobile was becoming the engine of American prosperity. The cars of that era were not engineered for the people inside them. They were built around engines, transmissions, and profit margins. Passengers sat on bench seats bolted to rigid steel frames with no safety considerations whatsoever. No belts, no padding. Nobody was designing cars for human survival because nobody had to. By age 11, Tucker was already behind the wheel of a car. By 16, he was buying old vehicles, repairing them, and reselling them at a profit. He briefly worked as an office boy at Cadillac, attended Detroit's Cass Technical High School, the same institution that would later produce John DeLorean, then left without a degree and tried a string of jobs, including a brief stint as a police officer in Detroit. What he had, though, was an instinct for selling that few people he ever worked with could match. He moved from dealership to dealership, from Memphis to Buffalo, eventually rising to zone manager for Pierce Arrow. In the 1930s, he formed a partnership with racing engineer Harry Miller. In 1935, the two convinced Henry Ford to fund 10 race cars for the Indianapolis 500. The project ballooned from $25,000 to $117. Miron and all 4 qualifying cars failed to finish. Ford never backed a racing program again. Tucker, however, walked away with a decade of engineering knowledge, connections across the American automotive industry, and the firm conviction that car buyers deserved something the Big Three weren't building. Through the early 1940s, he pitched aircraft designs to the military and developed a high-speed combat vehicle that reached prototype stage. None made production. But each project deepened his technical instincts, and by the time the war ended and consumers were desperate for new automobiles, Tucker knew exactly what he wanted to build and precisely why the industry he knew would resist every bit of it. The idea was technically specific, a rear-mounted engine like the engineering logic behind the Porsche to improve weight distribution and eliminate the noise, heat, and fumes that plagued rear passengers in conventional front-engine designs. 4-wheel independent suspension using rubber torsion tubes, eliminating metal springs and giving drivers a level of road control that no standard American production sedan could approach. He originally planned disc brakes and fuel injection, though time and budget would force compromises. But the safety features were the core of it. A padded dashboard to absorb impact, a windshield engineered to pop completely free of the frame in a crash rather than shatter across the faces of the people inside. A center headlight mechanically linked to the front wheels and activated at steering angles beyond 10 degrees, physically turning to illuminate the actual path of travel through a corner. 17 states had laws against cars with more than 2 headlights, so Tucker fabricated covers for those markets. Power came from a horizontally opposed 6-cylinder adapted from a Franklin helicopter aircraft engine, displacing 334 cubic inches and producing 166 horsepower from the rear of the car, 0 to 60 in 10 seconds. Estimated top speed of 120 miles per hour. In 1948, those numbers were remarkable. To build at scale, Tucker needed a factory. The federal government had a perfect one sitting idle, a former Dodge plant on the south side of Chicago, purpose-built during World War II to manufacture engines for B-29 bombers. The facility covered over 60 acres of floor space and came with foundries, tool shops, and forging equipment already in place. The War Assets Administration agreed to lease the entire complex to Tucker for just $25,000 down. Tucker Corporation was formally founded on July 8, 1946. The stock offering that followed was extraordinary. 44,000 individual Americans bought in, raising approximately $26 million in development capital. Tucker himself was involved in every aspect of the pitch, personally crisscrossing the country to meet dealers and investors, selling the car the way he had always sold everything, with his presence, his belief, and his certainty that what he was building was going to change the world. He was by all accounts magnetic. Writers who interviewed him invariably described a man who made you believe that everything he said was not only true but inevitable. The December 1946 issue of Science Illustrated ran early design sketches alongside what appeared to be a full-size photograph of the car. It was actually a 1/8 scale model, shot to look life-size. It didn't matter. The public was completely captivated. Tucker called his car the first completely new automobile in 50 years and projected a selling price of $2,450. On June 19, 1947, he unveiled the Tin Goose prototype before a crowd of 5,000 press members, dealers, and investors in the Chicago plant. Behind the curtain, workers were in a controlled panic. The suspension arms had snapped under 150-pound emergency backup batteries. Speeches stretched while mechanics worked furiously in the dark. Finally, the curtain parted. The car rolled out. The crowd went silent, then erupted. The Tucker 48 looked like nothing else on American roads. It looked like what every American had been told they were waiting for. The summer of 1948 should have been the beginning. Cars were genuinely rolling off the line. Slowly, by hand, but rolling. Then on June 6, 1948, Drew Pearson, a nationally syndicated Washington journalist with deep government contacts, told his millions of listeners that the SEC had launched an investigation into Tucker Corporation that would blow Tucker higher than a kite. 4 days later, his newspaper column amplified the attack. The damage was immediate and total. Creditors panicked. Franchise sales dried up. Supplier relationships vanished overnight. Stock prices collapsed. The SEC froze Tucker's operations by court order, halting the plant and laying off 1,600 workers in a single stroke. 44,000 individual investors, ordinary Americans who had believed in Preston Tucker, watched their stake evaporate. What made the situation extraordinary was what lay behind it. Michigan Senator Homer Ferguson, described in court documents by multiple sources as the senator from General Motors, had been applying pressure against Tucker for months, including using his influence to deny Tucker access to a critical steel processing facility in Cleveland. The SEC commissioner overseeing Tucker, Harry McDonald, also came from Detroit. And when the official SEC report was complete, McDonald personally delivered it to the Detroit News before Tucker's own legal team had read a word of it. An act he later admitted under federal testimony was a direct violation of law. Gigantic Tucker fraud charged in SEC report ran the headline across the city. Tucker's public trial had been held in the press without a single witness called in his defense. Furious, Tucker wrote an open letter that was published in newspapers across the country. In it, he addressed his 44,000 investors directly, those ordinary Americans who had believed in him and bought stock in what they were told was the future of driving. He asked them to hold on. He told them he had a clear conscience, a remarkable car, and the will to fight. But the letters didn't stop the slide. By Thanksgiving 1948, the plant had gone from 100 cars in production to a skeletal crew, finishing the last few that would ever be built before the doors closed. On June 10, 1949, a federal grand jury indicted Tucker and 7 associates on 31 counts, 25 of mail fraud, 5 of SEC violations, 1 of conspiracy. The trial opened October 5, 1949 in downtown Chicago. The day before it began, a judge voided the factory lease. Tucker arrived at court with no company, no plant, no money, and 50 production cars. His defense was to point at those cars. The prosecution's entire case rested on the Tin Goose prototype, arguing it differed from the car Tucker had advertised. But in November 1948, 7 Tucker 48s had lapped Indianapolis Motor Speedway publicly at 90 miles per hour, and the prosecution's witnesses could not explain those results under cross-examination. Tucker's defense also drew attention to Kaiser Frazer, another post-war startup that had received $44 million in government backing. When Kaiser Frazer's early cars turned out to be partly made of wood and the company eventually folded, there was no indictment, no grand jury, no 31-count charge sheet. 73 government witnesses were called over 3 months. The case came apart. On January 22, 1950, the jury found every defendant not guilty on all 31 counts. Tucker walked out of the courthouse with his name cleared, his company in bankruptcy, and 51 cars to show for everything. Here is what nobody rushed to print next. In 1966, Congress passed the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act, driven by years of safety research and the controversy over Ralph Nader's 1965 book Undefafe at Any Speed. Beginning with model year 1968, seatbelts became mandatory in every American passenger vehicle. Padded dashboards followed. Collapsible steering columns, Tucker had developed an early patent, were required under federal regulations. Windshield safety standards governing how glass could behave in a crash were codified across the 1960s and 1970s. Adaptive cornering headlights eventually reappeared on high-end European vehicles decades later. Feature by feature, the government legislated into law everything Tucker had built into his car in 1948. By 1968, a new car without seatbelts was illegal in the United States. The man the government called a fraud had been building a car that met safety standards that wouldn't be written for another generation. He was vindicated not in a courtroom but in the Federal Register, one mandatory safety standard at a time. Preston Tucker died on December 26, 1956 in Michigan. Lung cancer. He was 52 years old. He died with enormous debts, a cleared name, and a car the country had largely moved past. After the trial, he pursued licensing conversations with Italian manufacturer Simca and drafted new production concepts right up until his health gave out. Of the Tucker 48s ever produced, 47 survive to this day. One even sold at Barrett-Jackson for $2,915,000. The assets a court liquidated for nothing in 1950 now sell individually for millions. In 1988, Francis Ford Coppola directed Tucker, The Man in His Dream. The film received 3 Academy Award nominations and brought the story back after 4 decades of near silence. But even Coppola's version could not fully render the central irony. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one.